I've been doing this job long enough to know there are certain conversations that never really end. Religion, sex, politics, whether pineapple belongs on pizza. And somewhere near the top of that list sits one word that has somehow become both a campaign slogan and a Rorschach test: socialism. The funny thing is, everybody has a definition for it, and almost nobody is talking about the same thing. That's why on this particular night, I didn't feel like dancing around the issue. I wasn't interested in bumper stickers. I wasn't interested in campaign slogans. I wasn't interested in another round of politicians telling us that everything would be wonderful if we just trusted them one more time. No. I wanted to talk about reality. Because reality has this annoying habit of refusing to cooperate with ideology. And unlike politicians, reality doesn't care how many followers you have on social media. It doesn't care how many applause lines you get. Reality just keeps score. So I walked out on stage knowing exactly where I wanted to begin. Not with economics textbooks, not with think tank reports, not with another endless argument over political philosophy. I wanted to start with something that couldn't be argued away, something every person watching could understand within about 3 seconds. You know, I always joke that younger generations sometimes believe history started the week they got Wi-Fi. It's not their fault entirely. The internet has trained people to believe that if something happened before TikTok, it belongs in a museum. But history still matters. History is basically the world's longest running experiment. And unlike politicians, history doesn't edit the results. So I reminded the audience of something simple. We've tried these systems before, many times. They're not theoretical anymore. They're documented. Then came the image, one photograph, the Korean peninsula at night. You've probably seen it. If you haven't, it's impossible to forget once you do. On one side, South Korea. Right, alive, every city glowing, roads, businesses, homes, electricity stretching across the landscape like someone spilled diamonds across the map. Then your eyes drift north, darkness, almost complete darkness. A few isolated lights, that's about it. No speech could explain that picture better than the picture explains itself. People love arguing about economic theories. Pictures don't argue. Pictures simply exist. The audience reacted immediately because everyone understood what they were looking at: one peninsula, one people, one shared history, two completely different systems, two completely different outcomes. That wasn't a slogan. That wasn't Republican propaganda. That wasn't Democratic propaganda. That was geography. Then I moved to another comparison: Poland, Venezuela. Back in 1990, Venezuela was wealthier than Poland. Think about that for a second. Most people today probably assume Poland has always been one of Europe's success stories. Not true. History changes. Countries change. Policies matter. Poland emerged from Soviet-style economics and embraced capitalism. Years passed. Investment followed. Businesses grew. People bought homes. Families took vacations. Inflation stayed relatively low. Wages increased. The economy expanded until Poland became one of Europe's strongest performers. Meanwhile, Venezuela went in the opposite direction. They embraced Hugo Chávez's vision of socialism for the 21st century. Turns out, it looked remarkably similar to socialism from the 20th century. And, unfortunately for everyone living there, the ending wasn't exactly rewritten. Economic collapse, inflation, shortages, chaos, ag and history keeping score. The applause started before I'd even finished making the comparison. Because people weren't reacting to ideology. They were reacting to outcomes. That's always the uncomfortable part. It's easy to fall in love with promises. Results are much harder. Some ideas sound fantastic in campaign speeches. Reality eventually sends the invoice. That's the part nobody likes discussing. Everybody loves the honeymoon. Nobody wants to talk about the mortgage. I couldn't help laughing a little. Politics today has become a lot like online dating. Every profile looks incredible. Perfect photos, perfect descriptions. Everybody loves hiking. Everybody loves dogs. Everybody is passionate about helping people. Then you actually meet, and suddenly, reality shows up. That's what I said. Democratic socialism is starting to feel like one of those dating profiles. Everything sounds amazing, right up until real life arrives. The audience laughed because everybody's been there. Whether it was a bad date or a bad campaign promise, the setup always sounds better than the delivery. Then I brought up Vermont. Now, Vermont isn't exactly known as America's conservative fortress. Quite the opposite. It's small, liberal, politically friendly to the very ideas being discussed. If any place could successfully launch a statewide single-payer healthcare system, conventional wisdom suggested Vermont would be it. A population of roughly 626,000 people. Not 340 million, not 50 states, not an entire continent-sized country, just Vermont. And yet, the effort collapsed. Governor Peter Shumlin ultimately ended the project after projected costs became overwhelming. Payroll tax required to fund it would have been enormous. Businesses were raising concerns. The financial math simply wasn't cooperating. That matters. Because if supporters present a proposal as universally workable, then the first obvious question becomes, did it work where you had the best possible conditions? That's not a trick question. That's just how evidence works. If your prototype doesn't function in the smallest laboratory, people naturally wonder whether it'll work inside the largest one. I wasn't saying healthcare shouldn't improve. Far from it. America clearly has serious healthcare problems. Everybody knows someone who's battled insurance companies. Everybody knows someone afraid of medical bills. Nobody thinks the current system is perfect. The disagreement isn't over whether problems exist. The disagreement is over whether proposed solutions actually solve them. There's a difference, a huge difference. And that's where politics often becomes theater, because acknowledging complexity doesn't fit neatly into campaign commercials. It's easier to promise miracles. Miracles poll well, budgets don't. Then we got to Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie has never hidden what he believes. Whatever you think about him, one thing you can say is he's consistent. He praises democratic socialism. He argues wealth inequality has reached unacceptable levels. He believes government should play a significantly larger role in addressing those inequalities. During our conversation, he praised Zohran Mamdani's campaign. He spoke enthusiastically about grassroots organizing. He criticized the influence of wealthy donors. He argued that America faces extraordinary levels of income and wealth inequality. He pointed to Elon Musk's immense wealth compared with millions of American households. He talked about childhood poverty, senior poverty, health care, college affordability, housing. His argument was straightforward. Government, he said, should work for everyone instead of primarily benefiting billionaires. That's his position. He's stated it for years, no surprises. And that's precisely why I wanted the discussion, because labels matter. Definitions matter. If someone embraces democratic socialism, let's discuss democratic socialism honestly. Let's not pretend we're talking about something else. Too often, political debates become exercises in rebranding. Nobody wants the unpopular label. Everybody wants the popular policies. But eventually, voters ask questions, reasonable questions. What exactly are we proposing? How much does it cost? Who pays? What happens if the projections are wrong? Those aren't hostile questions. They're adult questions. Sometimes politics treats curiosity like betrayal. It shouldn't. Democracy depends on curiosity. I kept thinking about something that happens every election cycle. Candidates spend months telling people everything they're going to receive. Very few spend equal time explaining what those promises require. It's always free this, free that, guaranteed this, guaranteed that. Nothing is ever described as expensive. Funny how that works. Imagine hiring a contractor. He tells you he's going to remodel your entire house. Brand new kitchen, new bathrooms, swimming pool, home theater, guest house, landscaping. You ask, how much? He says, we'll figure it out. Would you sign that contract? Of course not. Yet somehow politics convinces people that's responsible planning. I don't blame voters. Everybody wants good health care. Everybody wants affordable education. Everybody wants opportunity. The question has never been whether those goals matter. The question is how you achieve them without creating entirely new problems along the way. That's the conversation I wanted. Not slogans, not applause, not partisan talking points, just evidence, history, results, and uncomfortable questions. Because uncomfortable questions are usually the beginning of honest conversations. And if we're ever going to solve America's problems, we're going to need a lot more honest conversations. By the time Bernie and I were sitting across from each other, I knew exactly where I wanted to steer the conversation. This wasn't about trying to score a viral clip or catch him in some gotcha moment. Bernie Sanders has been making the same basic argument for decades. Whether you agree with him or not, he's remarkably consistent. The challenge wasn't getting him to explain his beliefs. The challenge was testing those beliefs against questions that millions of Americans quietly ask every election season. I started with something that, in my mind, had become almost as controversial as the policies themselves, the word. Socialism. It's amazing how much emotional baggage can fit inside one word. For some people, socialism means fairness. For others, it means government overreach. For still others, it simply means Social Security checks arriving every month. We're all using the same word, but we're often describing completely different ideas. So I looked at Bernie and said something I genuinely believed. I want to help your campaign. That surprised some people. Whenever I criticize progressives, half the internet assumes I've secretly joined the Republican Party. Then when I criticize Republicans, the other half decides I'm suddenly a socialist. Apparently, the only acceptable position these days is total agreement with whichever team you've picked. I've never understood that. My loyalty has never been to a political party. It's been to asking uncomfortable questions. I told Bernie that Americans needed to understand what democratic socialism actually meant. Because if voters don't understand what they're being asked to support, the conversation never gets past slogans. Bernie immediately moved to income inequality. That wasn't surprising. It's the centerpiece of nearly every argument he makes. He talked about enormous concentrations of wealth. He argued that a tiny fraction of Americans controls an enormous share of the country's resources. He described that situation as morally unacceptable. And honestly, a lot of Americans hear those numbers and instinctively agree that something feels out of balance. But agreement on a problem isn't the same thing as agreement on a solution. That's where I interrupted him. I said something that I think often gets lost in these debates. Even many Republicans don't celebrate income inequality. They don't wake up every morning hoping wealth becomes even more concentrated. The disagreement isn't usually about whether inequality exists. The disagreement is about whether expanding socialism is the answer. Those are two separate conversations. Bernie responded by pointing toward programs Americans already support: Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, government institutions that millions of people rely upon. And here's where I found myself making what sounded almost like Bernie's argument. Americans already live with a significant amount of government involvement in their daily lives. We have Social Security, we have Medicare, we have Medicaid, we have unemployment benefits, we have housing assistance, we have disability programs, we have nutritional assistance, we have Obamacare. The military itself is one of the largest government institutions imaginable. The point wasn't that these programs are bad, quite the opposite. Many serve important purposes. The point was that America isn't some purely free market fantasy. Government already plays a massive role in American life. Which led me to a question I couldn't stop thinking about. If government is already spending enormous amounts of money, if wealthy Americans are already paying substantial taxes, if all of these programs already exist, why are so many problems still getting worse? That question tends to make everybody uncomfortable. Progressives often assume it sounds like an attack on government. Conservatives sometimes assume it's an argument for eliminating programs altogether. It isn't either. It's simply asking whether we're getting the results we're paying for. There's nothing radical about expecting performance. If I hire someone to renovate my house and 6 months later my roof still leaks, I'm probably going to ask a few questions. That doesn't mean I hate contractors. It means I expected results. Government shouldn't be exempt from that standard. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward taxes. Now we're entering territory that makes people deeply emotional. Taxes are one of those subjects where everyone believes they're an expert because everyone pays them, or at least everyone notices them. I mention something personal. Every year when tax season arrives, I sit down with accountants and watch an astonishing amount of my income disappear. Federal taxes, state taxes, local taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, healthcare-related costs. When everything gets added together, I estimated that close to 60% of what I earn ultimately goes toward government in one form or another. Now, before somebody clips that sentence out of context, no, I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm doing just fine. Nobody watching was expected to send me a care package. My point wasn't that successful people shouldn't contribute. My point was something much simpler. It becomes difficult to hear repeated claims that rich people don't pay taxes when you've personally watched an enormous percentage of your income leave your bank account every year. I even joked about it. The truly super rich, with armies of accountants and complicated financial structures, may have access to strategies that most people never see. Fine. That debate exists. But there are also plenty of people who are merely comfortably rich, people earning good incomes, business owners, professionals, entertainers, entrepreneurs. Many of them pay extraordinary amounts in taxes. Nobody throws them a parade. Nobody gives them a participation trophy. Mostly they get told they're still not paying enough. Comedy has always been useful for moments like this, because sometimes laughter allows people to hear an uncomfortable point without immediately shutting down. Then I cited a statistic that always catches people's attention. The top 10% of earners pay the overwhelming majority of federal income taxes. Meanwhile, the bottom half contributes a comparatively small percentage. Those numbers surprise people because they don't fit neatly into popular political narratives. Statistics rarely care about narratives. They're inconvenient that way. The interesting part isn't merely who pays. The interesting part is what happens afterward. If enormous sums are already flowing into government, where are the results? That's the question. Not because people object to helping others. Most Americans are remarkably generous. Look at natural disasters. Look at community fundraisers. Look at charitable giving. People help. They always have. The frustration comes when taxpayers see decades of increasing spending alongside problems that remain stubbornly unresolved: healthcare costs, housing affordability, education expenses, poverty, homelessness. These conversations never disappear. So naturally, people wonder, where is all the money going? That's a fair question regardless of ideology. Nobody should be afraid of accountability. Bernie and I eventually reached Medicare for all. Predictably, it was impossible not to. Healthcare sits at the center of nearly every modern political debate. Bernie argued that while a universal healthcare system would certainly cost a great deal of money, it would ultimately be more efficient than America's existing arrangement. That's been one of his central arguments for years. He believes replacing multiple systems with one national program would reduce inefficiencies and guarantee healthcare for everyone. That's his position. Then I brought up Vermont, not because I wanted a dramatic television moment, because it seemed impossible to ignore. If Medicare for all represented the future, what happened when Vermont tried implementing its own version? The governor eventually concluded the projected costs were simply too high. The program was abandoned. I asked Bernie directly, how do you explain that? His answer focused on differences between state governments and the federal government. He argued that a nationwide system would operate under entirely different financial conditions. Reasonable people can debate that. But Vermont still remained part of the discussion because it represented the closest real-world attempt under politically favorable conditions. Reality matters. Pilot programs matter. Testing ideas matters. Nobody builds a skyscraper without first making sure the foundation works. Politics shouldn't be different. Around that time, I found myself thinking about another image that had stayed with me. A 60 Minutes report on remote area medical clinics. If you've ever watched one of those stories, they're difficult to forget. Cars lined up overnight, families sleeping inside vehicles, people waiting hours simply for basic medical care. Volunteer doctors, temporary clinics, parking lots transformed into healthcare centers, someone getting a tooth pulled where a carnival might normally set up rides. That image bothered me. It still does. Because nobody should have to hope a nonprofit organization visits their town before they can see a doctor. Those are real problems, serious problems, but recognizing a problem doesn't automatically validate every proposed solution. That's another distinction politics often skips. Then I made another argument, one that predictably annoyed people on both sides. If taxes become high enough, particularly for the wealthiest individuals, some simply move. They relocate. Sometimes across state lines, sometimes across national borders, sometimes they move businesses, sometimes investments follow. This isn't really about whether that's morally admirable. It's about recognizing incentives. People respond to incentives, always have, whether you're discussing taxes, business regulations, or parking tickets. Human behavior doesn't disappear because politicians dislike it. Critics often point to migration patterns from states with high tax burdens. Others argue those movements result from multiple factors: housing costs, weather, employment opportunities, quality of life. Probably some combination of everything. Reality rarely has one single cause. Still, incentives matter. Ignoring incentives rarely makes them disappear. Imagine opening a restaurant. You raise every menu item to 3 times the price of nearby competitors. Then you act shocked when customers eat somewhere else. You can complain about customer loyalty all day. They're still buying burgers across the street. Economics isn't always ideological. Sometimes it's just people making practical decisions. That's why simplistic slogans almost always collapse under closer examination. Tax the rich. Okay, how much? What happens afterward? How much revenue actually appears? How much investment disappears? Which businesses remain? Which leave? Those aren't partisan questions. They're mathematical questions. Politics often prefers morality plays. Economics prefers arithmetic. Arithmetic can be incredibly rude. It doesn't care who gave the better speech. It just keeps adding columns. One thing I've learned after decades talking about politics is this: whenever someone promises that somebody else will pay for everything, ask for a calculator. Not because the promise is automatically impossible, because eventually someone has to show the math. If the math works, great. Let's discuss it. If it doesn't, no amount of applause changes the numbers. And that's really what I kept coming back to throughout the conversation. Not ideology, not labels, not personalities. Just the simple belief that ambitious promises deserve equally detailed explanations. If you're asking an entire country to reshape its economy, the burden of proof should be incredibly high. That's not unfair, that's responsible. Because once governments create massive programs, they're very difficult to reverse. My stakes become expensive, very expensive. History is full of well-intentioned policies producing unintended consequences. That's why skepticism isn't cynicism, it's caution. And in politics, caution is often underrated. By that point, the conversation had moved beyond labels. It wasn't really about whether someone called themselves a capitalist or a democratic socialist anymore. It had become something much simpler. What actually works? That's the question I wish Washington would ask more often. Not what sounds compassionate, not what sounds revolutionary, not what wins applause on cable news, what actually improves people's lives. Because here's the thing about politics. Everybody campaigns in poetry. Everybody governs in spreadsheets. Eventually, somebody has to balance the books. And spreadsheets don't care how inspiring your campaign slogan was. As we kept talking, Bernie returned to one of the central themes of his political career. Healthcare. He argued that America's current healthcare system is expensive, inefficient, and leaves too many people behind. On that point, very few people would argue. Healthcare in America frustrates almost everybody: patients, doctors, hospitals, employers, insurance companies. Nobody wakes up saying, you know what? This system is absolutely perfect. The disagreement has always been over the solution. Bernie maintained that a national single-payer system would ultimately prove more efficient. I listened. Then I came back to the same question, Vermont, because no matter how often the conversation drifted into theory, Vermont pulled it back toward reality. If the smallest, one of the most politically supportive states couldn't make the numbers work, why should Americans assume the same model would suddenly become easier across an entire nation of hundreds of millions? Again, that's not proof that every national proposal would fail, but it is a question that deserves an answer. And too often, politics treats questions like personal attacks. They aren't, they're part of the job. Then my thoughts wandered back to something I'd spoken about before. A story that had stayed with me because it represented the other side of this debate, the people waiting in line at remote area medical clinics, families sleeping in their cars overnight, parents hoping their children could finally see a doctor, people getting dental work done in temporary facilities because they couldn't afford regular care. That's heartbreaking. No political philosophy should ignore that. Those people aren't interested in ideological debates. They're interested in getting healthy. That's it. They don't care whether the solution comes from Democrats, Republicans, independents, libertarians, or Martians. They just want help, which is exactly why I get frustrated when political conversations become little more than team sports. Everybody starts cheering for their own jersey. Nobody checks the scoreboard. And the scoreboard should be people's lives, not Twitter trends. Somewhere along the way, I made another point that usually surprises people. I don't think the answer is pretending successful people are villains simply because they're successful. It's fashionable these days to talk about billionaires as though they've personally caused every problem in America. That's emotionally satisfying. It's also a very convenient story. Every story loves a villain, politics especially. But complicated societies rarely have one villain. They have thousands of moving parts. Housing shortages aren't caused by one billionaire. Healthcare costs aren't explained by one billionaire. Education expenses aren't explained by one billionaire. Government inefficiency isn't explained by one billionaire. Real life is usually messier than campaign speeches. That led me to an idea I joked about before. During a government shutdown, there was discussion about wealthy individuals potentially stepping in to help cover certain expenses. It made me laugh because it highlighted something fascinating. Some fortunes have become so enormous that individual billionaires can fund projects that would overwhelm entire cities. So I threw out an idea, half joke, half serious. Why not make philanthropy competitive? Call it the Adopt a Cause Challenge. One billionaire adopts schools, another focuses on veterans, another tackles homelessness, another funds medical research, another rebuilds communities after disasters. Why? Because wealthy people are famously competitive. If you're going to compete anyway, maybe compete over who can solve the biggest problem. The audience laughed, but underneath the joke sat a serious question. Right? If private wealth has become that immense, shouldn't some of that competitive energy be directed toward public good? People often misunderstand satire. They hear the punchline and miss the question underneath it. Comedy isn't always trying to provide policy. Sometimes it's trying to expose of contradictions. And America has no shortage of contradictions. We're the richest country on earth. We're also capable of producing stories that make you wonder how that's possible. Luxury neighborhoods exist a few miles away from communities struggling with basic services. Technology companies are building artificial intelligence, while some schools are still trying to replace outdated textbooks. Both things can be true. The challenge is figuring out why, not pretending one political slogan explains everything. Then another clip entered the broader discussion. Greg Gutfeld made an observation that immediately sparked debate. He argued that the highest earners already pay the largest share of federal income taxes. Agin, that's not a partisan slogan. It's a factual discussion about tax data. His follow-up question was provocative. If people argue that billionaires should pay the same rate as everyone else, why is the assumption always that their rate should move upward instead of everyone else's moving downward? Whether someone agrees or disagrees with that framing, it's undeniably a question that forces people to think differently. That's healthy. Good debates should force everyone to examine assumptions, including their own. Too much political discussion today begins with conclusions instead of questions. People decide what they believe first. Then they search for evidence afterward. That's backwards. Evidence should lead. Opinions should follow. I've always tried to approach politics from that direction. Sometimes it means conservatives get angry with me. Sometimes progressives do. Sometimes everybody gets angry. Honestly, that's usually how I know I'm asking worthwhile questions. If every political tribe is irritated, maybe you're standing somewhere near the middle of the road. Not because the middle is automatically correct, but because reality rarely belongs entirely to one side. As the evening wrapped up, I found myself thinking less about Bernie Sanders specifically and more about the broader direction of American politics. Bernie has spent years making his case. Millions of Americans admire him. Millions disagree with him. That's democracy. The important thing is that ideas should survive scrutiny. No proposal should be considered too sacred to question. No politician should become immune from criticism. Not presidents, not senators, not television hosts, certainly not comedians. I've spent decades making jokes at everyone's expense, including my own. That's part of the deal. If I can laugh at myself, politicians should survive a few uncomfortable questions. Because if your ideas can't withstand criticism on a television set, how are they supposed to survive governing an entire country? That, more than anything else, is what I hoped viewers took away from the conversation. Not that they had to agree with me. Agreement isn't the goal. Thinking is, America doesn't need more people memorizing talking points. It needs more people asking, does this actually make sense? Politics has become obsessed with certainty. I'm much more interested in curiosity. Curiosity built science. Curiosity built medicine. Curiosity built democracy. Certainty usually builds echo chambers. History teaches us something else. 2, every generation believes it's inventing brand new political arguments. Usually we're recycling old ones with updated graphics. The names change. The campaign ads get better. The hashtags become trendier. The fundamental questions stay remarkably consistent. How much government? How much freedom? How much taxation? How much responsibility? How do we help people without creating new problems? How do we encourage success while protecting those who struggle? Those questions don't disappear because somebody wins one election. They never have. They probably never will. And maybe that's okay. Democracy isn't supposed to produce permanent answers. It's supposed to produce ongoing conversations, hopefully informed ones, hopefully honest ones, hopefully conversations where people are willing to admit when evidence challenges their assumptions. I know that's asking a lot in modern politics. Outrage gets more clicks than nuance. Certainty gets more retweets than questions. But real progress almost always begins with someone willing to say, let's examine this more carefully. That's what I tried to do. Not declare victory, not crown one ideology as perfect. Just examine the evidence we already have, history, data, experience, real-world examples. Those things deserve a seat at the table. As the lights came down and the conversation ended, one thought stayed with me. No economic system is magical. Capitalism isn't. Socialism isn't. Government isn't. Markets aren't. Every system depends on the people running it. Competence matters. Honesty matters. Accountability matters. You can write the most beautiful policy proposal in the world. If it's managed poorly, people suffer. You can inherit a flawed system. If it's managed wisely, lives improve. Leadership matters. Far more than slogans. That's the lesson I keep coming back to after all these years. Not left versus right. Not Democrat versus Republican. Not capitalism versus socialism. Reality versus rhetoric. Because rhetoric can win an election. Reality governs the morning after. And eventually, every promise reaches the same destination. Balance sheet, that's where speeches stop. That's where governing begins. Maybe that's why I keep asking uncomfortable questions. Not because I enjoy making politicians squirm, although I'll admit that's occasionally a nice bonus. I ask them because millions of Americans are trying to figure out what kind of country they want to leave their kids. They deserve more than applause lines. They deserve honest debates. They deserve leaders willing to explain not only what they want to do, but how they plan to do it. And above all, they deserve a political culture that values evidence over slogans and results over promises. That's the conversation I hoped we started. Whether people agreed with me or not, I hope they walked away asking one simple question the next time they heard any grand political promise: show me the math.